I'm Mark Bomster. I'm the government and politics editor with Education Week, and I'm here with two journalists, with Alyson Klein, who is a political and congressional reporter for Education Week. She has followed both of these campaigns throughout the political season. With Liz Willen, who's associate editor of the Hechinger Report and a longtime education journalist. And also with Jeffrey Henig, who is chairman of the Department of Education Policy and Social Analysis here at Teachers College. And there's so much material to go over that I'm just going to try to dive right into things. And I'd like to start off with a question for Alyson. Alyson, you have been following both of these campaigns throughout the season. What I'd like to know is what did we hear here tonight that was really new from both of these folks? What are the areas that they amplified on, that they sharpened up? What are a couple of areas where we may not have heard anything which is so much new?
Well, I definitely think that when it comes to waivers, we heard probably more than we have so far from the Romney campaign. It sounds like they have some major concerns about the waivers that the Obama administration has put forth on ESEA. They're worried, first, on the one hand, that the waivers aren't flexible enough for states. And they're also very worried that those waivers set different standards for different sorts of students. And I know a lot of states out there are wondering whether they'll get to keep their waivers if Romney is elected president. And so I think there was some illumination on that tonight. We certainly heard Phil Handy really hammer on school choice, which has been the centerpiece of Governor Romney's education plan. And we also heard from Mr. Schnurr some very pointed questions about what Governor Romney would do when it comes to education funding, which he really highlighted as a big area of difference between the two campaigns.
Liz, which are some of the areas that you would focus in on? We can come back to each one of these in series.
Well, I just kept being struck by how clearly Phil Handy stated the limited role the federal government will play in the Romney administration. And that's not a surprise. We've been hearing that all along. But what I was waiting for him to articulate was what that vision is. Okay, we're hearing a lot about vouchers, but we're talking about kids and parents. And if they want to give us a vision of what it would look like to have that kind of choice, I feel like I'm still waiting to hear the details. He talks about choice and competition. He didn't really mention charter schools. He talked about choice and competition, but he didn't talk about what his vouchers would actually buy. The amount of them is extremely small. I mean, here in New York City, if you want to go to private school, kindergarten tuition is now over $35,000 a year. I can't imagine that's the kind of voucher he had in mind. It's not clear that private schools are willing to take vouchers, or even some parochial institutions. So with the intense emphasis on the limited role that government wants to play, I was waiting to hear of what kind of a vision he might actually be able to have for what that would look like.
Jeff, what do you think were some of the main takeaways, especially in this area?
Well, I think we got to see people who have been following this, a third type of debate, right? I mean, we saw the presidential debate where the candidates, the differences between them on the issues sometimes were blurred. We got to see the vice presidential candidate debate where the differences were very sharply articulated with some degree of edge and hostility. And here we saw a very nice, cuddly debate, but really big differences also
John
emerge.
didn't smirk once.
Yeah. and I think that's really interesting. I mean, and the reason is, Phil Handy started off by saying the importance of truth at the federal level, and I think I think he was sincere in talking about truth, and he was willing to sit here and say the truth is there are things that the Romney administration may wish would happen, but they're not going to make it happen. They're not going to address a true national accountability testing system. They're not going to address expanding higher ed support. They're not going to address early childhood if it costs money. I mean, the deficit really was looming thing. I'd mention one other thing that struck me, and I'll just mention it briefly when we may come back to it, which is what never was mentioned by either representative here, and that was Congress. We heard nothing about Congress and the politics of coalition building that either President Romney or President Obama would have to deal with in order to bring about and realize their vision.
Now, to go back to the money question, to the fiscal question, in his very closing, John Schnur did talk about the fact that there is a question of investment and what are you going to put your money into. The fiscal cliff is looming. We know that there are across the board cuts that are coming down the road unless something happens with the new administration, and that was hovering in the background. Allison, where do you think that this is? What kind of pressure does this put on both of the candidates that these folks represent?
Well, I think no matter who wins in November, obviously Congress is going to come back and we're going to have a very busy lame duck session where they're going to have to figure out how to avert, these looming trigger cuts that are coming in, whether to extend the Bush tax cuts. Obviously, that's in the background of any policy these folks are proposing. I thought that Schnur made a really interesting point when he, Governor Romney has said he doesn't want to cut education funding. We still don't really know exactly what that means. Does that mean he doesn't want to cut the two main formula programs, Title I and special education, but he would cut, say, Head Start, or he would cut, some, like Race to the Top, for instance? It sounds like he doesn't really want to necessarily invest there. So it's really hard to tell what exactly Governor Romney's plan is when it comes to education funding. It's also pretty hard to tell what President Obama's plan is going to be, how he's going to handle the fiscal cliff and the lame duck session. And I think Jeff really hit it when he said that Congress is a major player in this, and we may not be able to answer those questions without knowing who's going to be in control of the House and the Senate.
I wanted to dig a little bit more deeply into the waiver question, because that is a tremendous thing which is hovering out there. Currently, if President Obama is reelected, he's got waivers that are in effect. They presumably would go forward in some kind of a way. President Romney would then have to figure out how to fine-tune those things, would have to deal with the reauthorization of NCLB. There were some very pointed criticisms from Phil Handy about the disparate impact on subgroups, on minority students, on certain students that might be left behind in effect under the current system, and also pointed criticisms about how these waivers are prescriptive for the states. How do those two things square up?
To be totally honest, I don't think we got an answer on that tonight.
I think one of the reasons that waivers may have played such an important role in the presentation by Phil Handy is that it's true that the Obama administration got its main leverage in education from manipulation of the Race to the Top money, which came out of the fiscal stimulus. And it's true, as Handy said, that particular pot of money isn't going to be there again. What's, I think, playing at the back of the mind on the Romney side is that through waivers, Obama and Duncan are showing how you can still pull the line on fish that have the hooks in their mouth of receiving support, and get concessions out of simply allowing them to retain funding that they already have. So I think in the background here is a little bit of a setup, not just of a difference between Republicans who emphasize states and localities, which Phil Handy did, versus Democrats who believe in national leadership and investment, but also over the notion of an imperial presidency. And I think that part of the background issue on the waivers is the Romney administration prepared to argue against a strong presidential role in really driving some of these issues. Now, the dilemma for them then again, of course, is if they are the ones in the White House, are they going to still hold to this notion of a modest White House and a modest federal role? I'll say one more thing on that, which is one of the things that the Romney camp and Phil Handy identified as one of their provocative suggestions is the conversion of Title I to portable aid, to a form of vouchers. And that involves money that could go to private schools, charter schools, but also, at least they've framed it this way, to suburban schools. The notion is that inner city kids could pack up and go to the suburbs. That's something that would be hugely complicated politically for a Romney White House to bring about. It would run directly in the face of some of his core constituency in the suburbs and things like that. So we did not get a picture of how far he would really push to get suburbs to open up to this vision.
You know, I totally agree with Jeff on this, but I also have to say this idea of having the states be more in charge is rife with contradiction. Right, all from the start. On the one hand, he doesn't. He wants to take away their waivers, and yet he keeps talking about, because he doesn't believe in a strong federal role in education, that what they really want to do is give more power to the states. I think we need to look at that and think about how scary that might be. I'm just thinking that I came back from Mississippi, where I've been doing a lot of reporting, and it's the only state in the South that doesn't have state-funded pre-kindergarten. And the early childhood programs and that I witnessed, the ones that aren't supported by the private sector, are abysmal. But in a lot of the public schools, you have a full 10% of the kids, sometimes more, not being ready to pass kindergarten. The state doesn't want to give any funding for it. They're absolutely against it. They've repeatedly been against that. You're going to see that in a lot of states. So when you're talking about abdicating the federal role and passing it on to the states, again, I want to see how does that work? What's his vision for getting the states, who are also equally broke in this recession and can't afford programs like that? So who takes the lead to get the kind of services and programs that he said, we don't like those programs? Who takes the lead if the states are broke? I don't know if you guys had any thoughts on that.
This kind of doubles back a little bit to the waiver question. There was a very pointed criticism by Phil Handy of the way that the waivers have played out, the impact that it's had, once again, on these subgroups of very vulnerable students. To what degree was that really answered by the representative of the Obama administration? That's been a very heavy criticism.
Well, let me respond to the first part at least. I think it's interesting here, because one way to think about what we're seeing is in some ways this is a return to a much more familiar dynamic. This is a return to the dynamic of Republicans versus Democrats on education prior to George Bush. But the reason that, or I think a credible reason why George Bush and the Republicans made education an important part of their original campaign and then of the first Bush administration, was their recognition that they were losing politically by being the party whose only platform on education was push it back to the states and push it back to the families and communities, and that they needed a positive agenda. What we saw here, I believe, was more a return to the notion that Republicans on education don't need to have a positive agenda that they're identifying and laying out a plan to pursue, but that they can go back to the strategy of saying this is properly left to the states, right, which will vary from place to place, and communities and parents. And it's a philosophically coherent position for a Republican candidate to take, but it's a ultimately potentially politically risky one.
I think that's interesting. I do think that Mr. Handy was really clear that he sees a major role for the federal government in pushing school choice. And actually some other Republicans, Mike Petrilli from the Fordham Institute comes into mind, has said that Romney's plan in some ways would be a huge expansion of the federal role in a way when it comes to that particular policy, school choice. So they do have something, I think, that they're putting forward. I think that's a really good point that Liz made earlier about the fact that the voucher plan that the Romney folks are advocating, wouldn't cover probably the entire tuition at most private schools, certainly, or even many public schools. Federal money is only about an average 8% of the cost of educating a child. So I'm still curious where the other 92% comes from. But I do think that, Mr. Handy, and on behalf of Governor Romney, did articulate a clear vision for the federal role in pushing school choice.
Yeah, I think that depends a little bit about whether they're serious about putting political capital behind trying to make that come about. Again, it's very tricky for them to do that after pushing a states' rights agenda, given that state legislatures are not at all comfortable with the notion of treating school district boundaries as permeable and freeing kids, including inner city kids, to, wander across those boundaries with a small payment.
Just say the word busing.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. Now it's opt-in, as Phil Handy used to refer to some other things. Opt-in, and that leaves a lot of open-ended questions as to what this would look like in practice. I'd say one other thing in terms of this voucher issue that still has not been cleared out. For some reason, the Romney administration has really focused hard on the Obama administration's failure to support the extension of the DC scholarship program, the DC voucher program. That was a program that provided approximately $7,000 per student to go to private schools. I mean, and that goes a little bit to the point that John Schnur was making about how much would these relatively modest Title I funds really play in terms of making these lower income students attractive to private schools, to suburbs as potential students. And I think that's a real question mark out there. We know that by and large, I mean, the charter school movement is very diverse. There's a lot of schools out there that are very different. Some of them are very committed to serving low-income kids, and by and large, charter schools serve higher minority populations than traditional public schools in the nation. But charter schools, for the most part, have not said, we can do it cheap. That was the early rhetoric of school choice, but now the charter schools are out there saying, we need more money. We need money for facilities and the like. So that's where that clash between the constraining deficit, the primary emphasis on not expanding the deficit, and then how would you make these other things work in a way that really liberated parents and empowered parents, and that's unclear.
No, I think that's true, and I think, though, what you heard, I really appreciated this debate, having listened to the previous ones, and like everyone else, I'm really looking forward to hearing what they have to say tomorrow night and see how much education is going to remain on the agenda. But what we did get more details than we have gotten in a lot throughout this whole conversation. But what I heard repeatedly from John Schnur that was also really missing, and from Phil Handy's, John repeatedly talked about real positions that the Obama administration has advocated to improve conditions in education, improving teaching, even though some of his evaluation ideas have been really controversial, even though some of the things that he's tied to Race to the Top have not been easy to swallow, and some of the incentives have been difficult. But in terms of early childhood, he speaks with a vision of this is a really integral and important issue in our society, and can save a lot of money down the line, and can be one of the most important economic engines for our country, is getting kids ready for school. Same with his agenda around community colleges and college completion. And also what you've heard repeatedly over the last few years is concern that American students are falling behind the rest of the world. Repeated concern that our place is really potentially diminished, and our role as an economic powerhouse and as a society is damaged by subpar education and throughout. Just that sort of step back, well, we're going to collect data, well, we have a voucher plan that you heard from Phil Handy, did not address a sense of urgency. And there should be a sense of urgency about education in this country, and I'm just surprised I didn't hear it. It was more, that's really not our role. We'll collect data. And that urgency, I think, is important, and I hope we'll hear some more of that tomorrow night.
Did you hear some parallel? It occurred to me that there was some parallel between the two of these representatives when it came to the question of how do you leverage federal resources? Because on the one hand, you had Mr. Schnur talking about, yes, Race to the Top is not a continuing funding commitment going down the road, but look what it has done to spark innovation all over different areas. And you could say the very same thing from Mr. Handy, saying, yes, the voucher that we're going to offer is just a small portion of things, but look at how it's going to spark all kinds of different things that are going to happen. You had a little bit of an overlap in philosophy between these two guys and how they're going to move along. I wanted to raise the question, you talked a little bit about this opt-in, and that phrase came up when they touched on Common Core. And that is something that every state in the country is having, virtually every state in the country is having to deal with. They're out there training their teachers in how to teach this thing. It's something that they've opted in at the front end, and they've gotten some money to fund the assessments. We heard from Mr. Handy, yep, the states are going to have to pony up an awful lot more down the road to make this thing happen. What were your collective impressions about how these guys are dealing with Common Core, and how is that going to happen? We're down to the implementation phase of this.
Well, I think Mr. Handy was pretty clear that he thinks that states should be responsible for paying for and encouraging Common Core. Getting back to the waivers, he clearly does not want to see, and the waivers don't require states to adopt the Common Core, but they do require states to develop college and career-ready standards in the Common Core. As one option there. He obviously, it sounded to me like he thought that was even maybe going a little bit too far. Mr. Schnur said that that President Obama has helped encourage the spread of Common Core. That's actually gotten, there are some supporters of Common Core who are worried actually that President Obama has been taking maybe a little too much credit for it out on the campaign trail. So, I guess we'll see after the election whether or not the Common Core has become politicized.
I think even though both candidates would talk about incentives, and that's a common ground rhetorically, there was really some difference there in terms of what they were talking about as well. Early on in the development of ideas about applying market principles to public policy, many folks, including on the Republican side, considered choice to be valuable in the context of certain incentives, that incentives made a difference in terms of how choice would be exercised. So it was a legitimate government role to structure incentives to encourage certain kinds of behavior that would be socially beneficial. What I think I heard today, at least most explicitly in this opt-in issue in terms of Common Core, but in general, was that for Mr. Handy, manipulation of incentives itself is a constraint on choice, so that Obama's strategies to encourage states to have higher standards, for example, or to encourage states to pursue certain goals in terms of college prep or Common Core, that was not allowing opt-in. Opt-in has to come internally, not in response to structured incentives. Again, I think that's an intellectually coherent position, but to me it's a drift backwards towards a sort of a more laissez-faire market, individual and states' rights choice vision than we've seen in the Republican side and in the coalition that George Bush had constructed. I'll just make one more point about it. We may come back to that. Part of that coalition that the Republicans had constructed included corporate reformers who, of course, are big fans of business and markets in the abstract, but also had goals that they wanted to see government attain. And the challenge I think the Romney camp is trying to address here is how do they meet the push and pull from the states' rights conservatives who are reinvigorated compared to 10, 13 years ago, and from the more laissez-faire, get government off our back folks, without losing the sort of corporate sector that they've won back into their camp by their promise not to tax them, and we won't badmouth them on regulation and bank failures, but who do, I think, still care about college preparation and a national curriculum and economic competitiveness, and who may be made uneasy by some of those elements of ruling out strong national leadership on that.
Well, aren't there some inherent contradictions in this too, with sort of the backing off on the one hand of the federal role and giving it to the states, and on the other hand, his mixed sort of feelings about the Common Core? I don't know that I'm really squared on how he's handling those contradictions. And it could be, as you said, those so many constituencies that they're trying that they need to appeal to in these days before the election.
And one overall question about whether there's a kind of a whole child investment that they touched on this at the very end of their debate. They kind of talked about the question of what role does the community play, what role do social and economic factors play, and there seemed to be some kind of a fundamental philosophical disagreement about whether this is something that the federal government has a role or how big the federal government's role is in doing this. They touched on it when they talked about Head Start, and there seemed to be a very strong divide on that issue. Any responses to that?
I actually heard a new argument tonight from Mr. Schnurr that I thought was really interesting when it came to the whole child and federal funding. He talked about how even if you keep, say, education funding intact, you're still losing, you could still be losing money for, wraparound services that the federal government provides, such as he used school lunch as an example. And I thought that was sort of a new argument from the Obama administration about these cuts, and one that I thought was really interesting, could be very effective.
Yeah, so I'm a political scientist. I like to think about constituencies and satisfying internal constituencies. And I mentioned the challenge for Romney of having strange bedfellows of states' rights and laissez-faire advocates and corporate reformer types. The Obama administration has had the same challenge, which is strange bedfellows. On the one hand, they've had the teachers' unions that are traditionally a very important part of the Democratic constituency, but they've also had a new Democratic reform push from folks who have been dissatisfied with what they saw as the reticence of traditional education systems to sufficiently aggressively pursue change. What I thought was interesting today is while I think the Obama campaign still has that challenge, they're actually in a lot better position now to solve that than they were before. They've paid the dues of standing up to the teachers union on a number of issues, on their expansion of support for charters, for example, on their support for testing and accountability and value-added testing. And what I heard today from John Schnurr was a sort of a step 2 of the Obama-Duncan plan that I think will be more appealing to educators in the classroom. The notion of richer assessments, for example, a clear, skepticism towards over-focus on standardized tests in math and science, a response to the notion that even though schools are important and we can't wait for poverty to be solved, we also have to be attentive to non-school factors. So I think the Obama administration is better positioned right now to keep its internal constituencies happy and more balanced, while it's the Romney administration that hasn't found that balance point yet.
Liz, some thoughts from you, and really kind of in closing, because I think we're
and I think those are really interesting closing points. But I just wanted to go back to the early childhood piece, because we didn't really have a chance to discuss that. It was very interesting. What I heard from Mr. Handy was something I have not heard a lot of in the campaign before, and that was the only initiative I heard discussed about early childhood. We talked a lot about it, and John Schnurr talked a lot about what Obama had tried to accomplish with early childhood, and he spoke a lot about how the solution sort of lies in Head Start and perhaps making it more academic. I think that is a fascinating story that needs to be told, and I'd love to hear more specifics about that. It's not a great way to wrap up the debate, but it's a very interesting question going forward, and one that we need to really think about.
I would just like to add that's something that the Bush administration actually tried, and they tried to move Head Start to the Department of Education, make tests a part of the program, and they got a lot of pushback from Congress. So I'd have to see the specifics of the Romney plan, but I would expect that there would definitely be some political pushback there.
Thank you very much, Allison, and I think we're going to have to hold it there. We could go on all night. I want to thank everybody for sticking around for the discussion, and please go online to take a look at our live webcast. It'll be archived on Education Week. And thank you so much for coming.